The shot that missed its mark ricocheted off the wooden post beside Lila Kincaid's head, splintering the porch beam and sending her diving for cover behind a stack of flour barrels. It was the fourth attempt on her life this month, but the first one bold enough to target her at home in broad daylight. Lila's hands trembled as she gathered her skirts around her knees, pressing her back against the rough wooden boards of her small homestead. This wasn't how she'd planned to spend her 23rd birthday, cowering on her own porch while some coward with a rifle took potshots at her from the distant tree line. She peered around the edge of the barrel, her honey-brown eyes scanning the horizon. Whoever it was had disappeared, leaving only the faint dust trail of a retreating horse. She knew exactly who was behind it: Thaddeus Holloway, the railroad baron who'd been pressuring every landowner within 50 miles of Redemption Creek to sell. Most had given in to his increasingly violent tactics. Lila was among the stubborn few who remained. The year was 1876, and the promise of the Transcontinental Railroad had transformed the Western Territories into a battleground between progress and tradition, between corporate money and individual rights. Lila had inherited her father's small ranch and trading post when he'd passed away 3 months prior, leaving her alone to face Holloway's relentless pursuit of her strategically positioned land. She waited another 10 minutes before daring to stand, brushing the dust from her simple blue calico dress. The town of Redemption Creek, Wyoming, lay 3 miles to the east, its collection of wooden storefronts and saloons visible in the distance. She should report the shooting to Sheriff Watts, but what good would it do? The aging lawman was firmly in Holloway's pocket, his badge nothing more than a decoration for a man who enforced only the laws that benefited his benefactor. Lila sighed, picking up the basket of eggs she dropped when the shot rang out. Half were broken, the contents seeping through the wicker and onto the porch boards. Another small loss in what had become a mounting series of setbacks. As she cleaned up the mess, a movement on the horizon caught her eye. A lone rider approached from the northwest, his form silhouetted against the setting sun. Something about the way he sat his horse tall, straight-backed but easy in the saddle, sent a chill of recognition through her, though she couldn't possibly see his face at this distance. "No," she whispered to herself, her heart quickening. "It can't be." But as the rider drew closer, there was no mistaking the distinctive paint horse with its unique black and white markings, nor the broad-shouldered figure of the man who rode it. Preston Vale, the most wanted man in 3 territories, was approaching her homestead with the deliberate pace of someone who knew exactly where he was going: Preston Vale. The name alone was enough to make hardened men reach for their guns and women clutch their children closer. Tales of his exploits had grown to legendary proportions over the past 2 years: bank robberies in Denver, a jailbreak in Cheyenne, the spectacular theft of a gold shipment bound for San Francisco. Some said he'd killed a dozen men in gunfights. Others claimed he'd never drawn first but never lost. Wanted posters offered $3,000 for his capture, dead or alive, with his face sketched beneath the bold lettering. What none of the posters mentioned was that before he became an outlaw, Preston Vale had been Redemption Creek's deputy sheriff, or that he'd been Lila's childhood friend. Or that on the night before he disappeared, he'd kissed her under the cottonwood tree by the creek and promised to return for her someday. That was 3 years ago, before the war between the ranchers and the railroad had begun in earnest, before her father had taken ill. Before Preston had been forced to flee after being framed for a murder everyone knew Holloway's men had committed. Now he was back, riding openly toward her home as though there weren't 24 men in town who'd shoot him on sight for the reward money. And despite everything, the danger, the years of silence, the unanswered questions, Lila found herself stepping out into the yard to meet him, her hand raised to shield her eyes from the setting sun. Preston slowed his paint horse to a walk as he approached the final stretch to Lila's homestead. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair that had grown longer since she'd last seen him. His face was more weathered now, tanned by sun and marked by experiences she could only guess at. A scar she didn't recognize ran along his jawline, but his eyes were the same deep green and steady as they fixed on her. He stopped his horse 20 paces from where she stood, seemed to hesitate, then swung down from the saddle with the fluid grace that had always made him appear more at home on horseback than on foot. "Hello, Lila," he said, his voice deeper than she remembered. "You've got a lot of nerve showing your face around here, Preston Vale," she replied, her tone sharp even as her eyes took in every detail of him: the worn leather vest over his cotton shirt, the twin Colt revolvers holstered at his hips, the confidence in his stance that hadn't been there before. "Half the territory wants you dead." "Only half," a ghost of a smile crossed his lips. "I must be losing my touch. This isn't funny. Sheriff Watts has a new deputy now, young, eager to make a name for himself. If he spots you—" "I didn't come back for the sheriff," Preston said, taking a step toward her. "I came back for you." Those simple words, spoken without embellishment, struck Lila like a physical force. She'd imagined this moment 100 times after he disappeared: what she would say, how she would react. In her imagination, she'd been cool and distant, making him work for her forgiveness. Sometimes she'd pictured herself turning him away entirely. But now, faced with the reality of Preston standing before her, all those imagined scenarios evaporated. What remained was the simple truth: she'd missed him desperately. "You're 3 years too late," she said, trying to hold onto her anger even as it slipped away. "Where were you when my father was dying? When Holloway's men began threatening everyone who wouldn't sell? When I needed you?" Preston winced at her words, his hand tightening around the brim of his hat. "I wanted to come back sooner, but it would have brought trouble down on you and your father. I was a wanted man, Lila, and what's changed now? Everything." His green eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I found proof that Holloway ordered the murder I was framed for, proof that he's been bribing officials all across the territory. I've spent 2 years gathering evidence against him." Lila's mind raced. Evidence? What kind of evidence? Papers, ledgers, letters in his own hand ordering problems to be eliminated, names and dates of payoffs. Enough to put him away for good, or at the very least, destroy his credibility with the railroad company backing him. Hope flared in Lila's chest, quickly tempered by caution. "And you came straight here with this evidence? Preston, there are men watching my property. Holloway's men. One of them took a shot at me not 30 minutes ago." Preston's expression darkened. "Are you hurt?" "No, but show me where the shot came from." Lila pointed toward the tree line to the south of her property. Without another word, Preston strode back to his horse, pulled a Winchester repeating rifle from its scabbard, and checked the loading mechanism. "Stay inside," he instructed. "Lock your doors." "Preston, wait." Lila moved toward him, catching his arm. "You can't just ride off after them. There's at least 3 of Holloway's men watching the property at any given time." "3 men isn't a problem," he replied with a confidence that wasn't boastful, simply matter of fact. "It's a problem for me if you get yourself killed the minute you show up," Lila snapped. "I've been handling Holloway's threats for months. Another day won't make a difference." Preston studied her face. "You've changed." "We all have." She released his arm. "Now come inside before someone spots you. You can tell me about this evidence and we'll figure out what to do next." He hesitated, then nodded, returning the rifle to its scabbard. 5 minutes, then I want to check the perimeter of your property." 10 minutes, and you'll have something to eat first," Lila countered, already moving toward the house. "You look like you haven't had a proper meal in weeks." A genuine smile broke across Preston's face for the first time. "Some things haven't changed, I see. Still trying to feed everyone who crosses your path." "Only the ones who look like they might fall off their horses from hunger," she retorted, but there was no heat in her words. Despite everything, the danger, the years of silence, the complicated feelings his return stirred up, it felt strangely right to have Preston Vale back on her porch. Inside the modest 2-room cabin, Lila moved efficiently around the small kitchen area, stoking the fire in the cast iron stove and placing a pot of yesterday's stew to heat. Preston stood awkwardly near the door, his tall frame making the room seem smaller than it was. "You can sit," she said, gesturing to the simple wooden table where her father had taught her arithmetic and where they'd shared their last meal together before his passing. Preston removed his gun belt first, setting it carefully on a bench by the door before taking a seat at the table. The domesticity of the moment struck Lila as surreal, the most wanted outlaw in the territory sitting at her kitchen table, as though he'd just returned from a day's work on the range. "Your father?" Preston asked quietly, glancing around the cabin that showed touches of Matthew Kincaid's handiwork everywhere, from the carved wooden shelves to the decorative scrollwork on the mantelpiece. "Pneumonia took him 3 months ago," Lila answered, her back to Preston as she sliced bread. "It was quick at least, he didn't suffer long." "I'm sorry, Lila, he was a good man." "Yes, he was." She placed a plate of bread and a jar of honey on the table, along with a cup of coffee. "And he believed in you, even after everyone else decided you were guilty. Kept saying there was no way Preston Vale would murder a man in cold blood, not even for money." Preston's eyes softened. "I wish I could have thanked him for that faith." "You can thank him by proving he was right," Lila said, bringing over a bowl of stew and setting it before him. "Now eat while you tell me about this evidence against Holloway." As Preston ate, he explained how he'd been tracking Holloway's operations across the territory, following the railroad baron's web of corruption from town to town. It had started as a quest to clear his own name, but had evolved into something larger as he witnessed the devastation Holloway's tactics left behind burned-out homesteads, displaced families, and communities divided. "It's not just Redemption Creek," Preston explained between mouthfuls of stew. "He's doing this all along the proposed railway line, buying out those who'll sell, forcing out those who won't. I've counted 17 suspicious deaths connected to properties Holloway wanted." "And you have proof of his involvement?" Lila asked, sitting across from him with her own cup of coffee. Preston nodded. "I've been working with a federal marshal named Donovan. He's been building a case against Holloway for months. When I found him and told him my story, he was skeptical at first. But then I started bringing him information, names, dates, locations." "A federal marshal," Lila repeated, hope kindling in her chest. "Someone with authority beyond Holloway's reach." "Exactly. Donovan believes we have enough evidence now to bring charges, but he needs one more piece, a ledger book that details Holloway's payoffs to local officials, including the circumstances of my framing and the real killer's identity." "And where is this ledger?" Preston's expression grew grim. "That's the problem. It's in Holloway's office in town, in a safe behind his desk." Lila set down her coffee cup with a sharp clink. "So you need to break into the most heavily guarded building in Redemption Creek, crack a safe, and escape with evidence, all while being the most recognizable wanted man in the territory." "That's about the size of it," Preston agreed, his tone frustratingly calm. "But I didn't come here to ask for your help with that part." "Then why did you come here, Preston? Why now, after all this time?" His green eyes met hers directly. "Because Donovan's received intelligence that Holloway plans to make an example of the remaining holdouts this week. Starting with you. That shot today wasn't meant to kill you, Lila. It was a warning. The real attack is coming tomorrow night." The blood drained from Lila's face. "How do you know this?" One of Donovan's informants works as a secretary in Holloway's office. She overheard him giving the orders. Preston leaned forward, his expression intense. "I came to get you out of here, Lila, to take you somewhere safe until this is over." Lila stood abruptly, pacing the small confines of the cabin. "Leave? I can't just leave. This is my home, my father's legacy. Everything he worked for is here." "And none of it will matter if you're dead," Preston countered, rising to his feet as well. "I'm not asking you to give up, just to withdraw temporarily. Once we have the evidence and Holloway is arrested, and if something goes wrong. If you can't get the ledger, or if Holloway escapes prosecution somehow, what then? Then at least you'll be alive to fight another day." Lila shook her head stubbornly. "No, I won't run. This is my home, and I've spent the past 3 months defending it alone. I won't abandon it now." Preston ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "Damn it, Lila. This isn't about being brave or stubborn. Holloway's bringing in professional gunmen for this, the kind who have done this before and won't hesitate to burn this place to the ground with you in it." "Then we'll be ready for them," she replied, her mind already working through possibilities. "How many men? When exactly are they coming?" Preston stared at her for a long moment, then sighed, recognizing the determination in her eyes. Donovan's information suggests 5 or 6 men, scheduled to arrive on tomorrow afternoon's train. The attack is planned for tomorrow night. Then we have until tomorrow night to prepare. Lila moved to a trunk in the corner of the room, kneeling beside it and lifting the lid. She withdrew a shotgun and a box of shells. Father always said a shotgun evens the odds in close quarters. Preston watched her with a mixture of admiration and concern. You're planning to fight off half a dozen professional killers with one shotgun. No, Lila replied, looking up at him with a determined smile. I'm planning to fight them off with one shotgun, whatever firearms you're carrying, and any other advantages we can create between now and then. For a moment, Preston said nothing. Then slowly, a smile spread across his face, not the cautious half-smile from earlier, but a full, genuine expression that transformed his features and brought back memories of the boy Lila had known before everything changed. Matthew Kincaid's daughter through and through, he said softly. Stubborn as a mule and twice as brave. He would have said foolish rather than brave, Lila responded, but she felt a warmth in her chest at the comparison to her father. Maybe. Preston crossed to where his gun belt lay and buckled it on with practiced ease. But if we're going to do this, we'll need more than courage and a shotgun. We need a plan. Lila nodded, feeling the weight of the situation settle over her. Then let's make one. The next few hours were spent in tense preparation. Preston first insisted on scouting the perimeter of Lila's property, moving silently through the growing darkness to identify potential approach routes and defensive positions. When he returned, they sat at the kitchen table with a rough map of the homestead, planning their strategy by lamplight. Your best advantage is that you know this land, Preston explained, his finger tracing the boundary of her property on the hand-drawn map. Every rise, every dip, every place where the ground gets soft after rain. Lila nodded, pointing to several locations. The creek bed here floods easily. And this stretch of ground near the old oak has prairie dog holes that could trip a horse if the rider doesn't know they're there. Preston's eyes gleamed with approval. Exactly the kind of knowledge that can turn the odds in our favor. Now the house itself is both your greatest asset and your greatest vulnerability. Because it's shelter but also a trap if surrounded, Lila finished his thought. Yes, we need to create routes of escape and alternative fighting positions. Preston frowned, studying the layout of the small cabin. Is the root cellar still accessible from inside? Yes, Father expanded it last year before he got sick. The entrance is under the rug in the bedroom. Good, that gives us an emergency exit if needed. Preston marked it on the map. What about supplies, food, water, ammunition? Lila rose and moved to the pantry, taking inventory as she spoke. We have enough food for a week at least, water from the well out back, ammunition. She hesitated. Not as much as I'd like. 2 boxes of shotgun shells, maybe 30 rounds for Father's old Remington revolver. Preston nodded thoughtfully. I have about 60 rounds for my Colts, plus 20 for the Winchester. Not enough for a prolonged fight, but it'll have to do. As they continued planning, the conversation shifted between practical preparations and moments of unexpected personal connection. In the midst of discussing sight lines and defensive positions, Preston suddenly asked about the family of bluebirds that had nested in the old oak tree. Every spring did they still return? And Lila found herself inquiring whether Preston still played the harmonica that his father had given him before he died. These small questions served as bridges across the 3-year gap in their lives, tentative connections rebuilt amidst preparations for violence. Neither of them explicitly mentioned the kiss they'd shared before Preston left, nor the promises spoken that night, but the memory of it hung in the air between them, unacknowledged yet undeniably present. As midnight approached, exhaustion began to take its toll. Lila suppressed a yawn as she finished listing the supplies they'd need to gather in the morning. You should get some sleep, Preston said, noticing her fatigue. Tomorrow will be a long day. What about you? She asked, suddenly realizing the awkwardness of their sleeping arrangements in the small cabin. Preston gestured toward the front porch. I'll keep watch outside. It's a mild night. Don't be ridiculous, Lila retorted. You've been riding for days. You need rest too. I'll take the bedroom. You can have the main room. For a moment, Preston looked as though he might argue, but then nodded, too tired to protest. "Wake me in 4 hours and I'll take over the watch. Deal." Lila gathered a blanket and pillow from the bedroom for him, setting them on the small sofa near the fireplace. As she handed them to Preston, their fingers brushed briefly, sending an unexpected jolt of awareness through her. "Lila," Preston said softly, not releasing the blanket, his eyes holding hers in the dim lamplight. "Thank you for not turning me away today. I wouldn't have blamed you if you had." The sincerity in his voice pierced through the layers of caution she'd built around her heart. "You still have a lot to answer for, Preston Vale, but right now we have more pressing concerns than settling old scores." He nodded, releasing the blanket. "Get some rest. I'll wake you if anything changes." Lila retreated to the small bedroom, closing the door behind her. She changed quickly into a simple cotton nightgown, then sat on the edge of the bed, her mind too full for sleep despite her body's exhaustion. Outside, she could hear Preston moving quietly around the cabin, checking locks and peering through windows. Preston Vale. The most wanted man in the territory. The boy who'd taught her to skip stones across the creek when they were children. The deputy who'd once walked her home from church socials, respectful and proper. The man who'd kissed her beneath the cottonwood tree and promised to return. And now he had returned, bringing with him danger and hope in equal measure. Tomorrow they would face Holloway's men together, perhaps to die defending her father's land. Yet despite the peril, Lila found herself grateful that whatever happened, she would not face it alone. With that thought, she blew out the lamp and lay down, listening to the familiar creaks of the cabin and the new, comforting sounds of Preston's presence in the next room, until sleep finally claimed her. Dawn arrived with a crimson streak across the eastern sky, bleeding into the purple night. Lila woke with a start, immediately aware that something was wrong. She had slept through the night, not the 4 hours she'd agreed upon with Preston. She dressed quickly in a practical riding skirt and blouse, securing her hair in a simple knot at the nape of her neck. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Preston already awake, his back to her as he stood at the stove. The smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the small cabin. "You were supposed to wake me," she said accusingly. Preston turned, a skillet in his hand and an unapologetic expression on his face. "You needed the rest more than I did. I'm used to short nights." "That wasn't our agreement," Lila countered, but she accepted the plate he offered her, laden with bacon and johnnycakes drizzled with the last of her precious maple syrup. "Consider it payment for the meal last night," Preston replied, pouring her a cup of coffee. Besides, the night was quiet. No sign of Holloway's men. They ate quickly, discussing the day's preparations. Immediately after breakfast, they began implementing their defensive plan. First, they moved the most valuable and portable of Lila's possessions, her mother's silver, her father's pocket watch, important papers and photographs, into a wooden crate that could be quickly retrieved if they needed to flee. Next, they prepared the cabin itself. Preston helped Lila move the heavy oak sideboard to block the east-facing window, leaving just enough space to fire through. They filled every available container with water, positioned ammunition at strategic points throughout the cabin, and prepared medical supplies in case of injury. By mid-morning, they had moved outside to set up defenses on the property. Using Preston's experience and Lila's knowledge of the land, they created subtle traps and obstacles designed to channel attackers into the most exposed positions. "We don't want anything too obvious," Preston explained as they worked to partially loosen a section of fence rails. "If they spot prepared defenses, they'll know we're expecting them and change their approach." The noon sun found them digging shallow trenches at key points along the most likely approach routes, not deep enough to be noticed at a distance, but sufficient to trip a running man or slow a charging horse. As they worked, the conversation flowed more easily between them, the rhythm of shared labor breaking down some of the barriers that 3 years of separation had built. "I still can't believe you've spent 2 years gathering evidence against Holloway," Lila said, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. "The wanted posters make you sound like some kind of desperate bandit." Preston smiled wryly as he tamped down the earth they'd disturbed, making it appear undisturbed to casual observation. I won't pretend I've lived like a saint. I've done things I'm not proud of to stay alive and keep moving. But I never killed anyone who wasn't trying to kill me first, and I never stole from anyone who couldn't afford the loss. A principled outlaw, Lila remarked with a raised eyebrow. An outlaw with a purpose, he corrected her. Everything I've done has been building toward bringing Holloway down and clearing my name. And after that, Lila asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. If you succeed when you succeed, what then? Preston paused in his work, his green eyes finding hers across the shallow trench. That depends. On what? On whether there's still a place for me here, on whether some promises can still be kept, even after so much time. The directness of his gaze made Lila's heart beat faster. They both knew he wasn't talking about Redemption Creek as a town, but about her, specifically about the words they'd exchanged under the cottonwood tree 3 years ago. Before she could formulate a response, the distant sound of hoofbeats interrupted the moment. Both of them instinctively dropped lower, Preston's hand moving to his holstered revolver. One rider, he murmured, his experienced ear gauging the approaching horse, coming fast from the direction of town. They retreated quickly to the cabin, positioning themselves on either side of the front window. As the rider came into view, Lila recognized the dappled gray mare belonging to Elias Cooper, the elderly blacksmith who had been a friend of her father's. "It's Elias," she said with relief, stepping out onto the porch as the older man reined his horse to a stop in the yard. "Miss Lila," Elias called, his weathered face creased with concern. "You need to be careful," he broke off abruptly as Preston emerged from the cabin behind her, his hand still hovering near his gun. "Good Lord, is that Preston Vale?" "Hello, Elias," Preston greeted the blacksmith calmly. "It's been a while." The older man gaped for a moment, then seemed to gather his wits. "I never believed what they said about you, boy. Neither did Matthew, God rest his soul." "Thank you for that," Preston replied quietly, "but I'm guessing you didn't ride out here just for a reunion." Elias shook his head, turning back to Lila. "I came to warn you. Holloway's brought in new men on the noon train, rough-looking sorts, the kind that carry their guns like they know how to use them. They're gathered at the saloon now, but word is they're planning something for tonight." Lila and Preston exchanged a glance. The intelligence had been accurate. "How many men?" Preston asked. "5 that I saw, plus Holloway's regular thugs." Elias looked between them, his expression growing more concerned. "What are you two planning? Whatever it is, you're outnumbered." "We're aware," Lila assured him, "but we're not without resources or strategy." Elias frowned, clearly unconvinced. "I've got my old Sharp's rifle at the shop. I could, no," both Lila and Preston said simultaneously. "This isn't your fight, Elias," Lila continued more gently. "You have Louise and your grandchildren to think about. And Holloway won't hesitate to burn down your shop if he suspects you're helping us," Preston added. "The best thing you can do is return to town as if you were just making a social call and keep your eyes and ears open. If you see them assembling to ride out, try to get word to us." The blacksmith hesitated, clearly torn between his desire to help and the wisdom of Preston's advice. Finally, he nodded reluctantly. "I don't like leaving you two to face them alone." "We're not entirely alone," Preston said cryptically. "We have resources in play that Holloway doesn't know about." This wasn't strictly true, but it seemed to reassure Elias. After extracting promises that they would be careful, the blacksmith remounted his horse and headed back toward town, though not before pressing a small package into Lila's hands, extra shotgun shells he'd brought, just in case. As the dust from Elias's departure settled, Lila turned to Preston. "Resources in play. Was that just to make him feel better about leaving, or is there something you haven't told me?" Preston's expression was unreadable. "Marshal Donovan knows I came to warn you. If all goes according to plan, he'll be in Redemption Creek by tomorrow morning with a federal warrant for Holloway's arrest." "Tomorrow morning," Lila repeated flatly, "so we only need to survive until then." "That's about the size of it," Preston agreed. "Assuming Holloway's men attack tonight as expected, and if they don't, then we get an extra night to prepare, But given Elias's report, I think our timeline is accurate. Preston checked the position of the sun, now well past its zenith. We have maybe 4 or 5 hours of daylight left. Let's make them count. They returned to their preparations with renewed urgency, completing the defensive measures they'd planned. By late afternoon, they had transformed the seemingly ordinary homestead into a carefully prepared battleground, though one whose defenses remained largely invisible to the casual observer. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the land, Lila and Preston returned to the cabin for a simple meal of cold ham and biscuits. Neither had much appetite, but both recognized the need for sustenance before the coming confrontation. "We should position ourselves before sunset," Preston said as they finished eating. "If they follow the pattern I've observed in other attacks, they'll approach under cover of dusk, enough light to see by, but dim enough to make identification difficult if any witnesses survive." Lila nodded, rising to check her shotgun one final time. "I'll take the position behind the woodpile covering the eastern approach. You take the south corner of the porch where you can see the main road. And if they split their forces to surround us." "Then we fall back to the cabin as planned," Lila replied, "using the routes we've prepared to reach our secondary positions." Preston studied her face, his expression a complex mixture of admiration and concern. "You know, most women would be terrified at the prospect of what's coming." "Who says I'm not terrified?" Lila countered, meeting his gaze steadily. "But fear doesn't change what needs to be done. My father taught me that." A smile touched Preston's lips. "He taught me the same lesson, though in different words. The day I joined the sheriff's office, Matthew told me that courage isn't about not being afraid, it's about doing what's right despite the fear." "That sounds like father," Lila agreed, her throat tightening with emotion. Preston stepped closer, his voice softening. "Lila, if things go wrong tonight, they won't," she interrupted, not wanting to contemplate failure. "But if they do," he persisted, "I need you to know that everything I've done these past 3 years, every risk, every sacrifice has been leading back here. Back to you." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, stripping away pretenses and evasions. Lila looked up into Preston's face, seeing past the hardened exterior to the man she had known, the man who, despite everything, she had never stopped caring for. "I spent a year waiting for you to come back," she admitted quietly. "Another year being angry that you didn't, and this last year just trying to survive. I never expected you to ride back into my life the way you did yesterday, Preston, and I still have questions that need answers, but right now." She trailed off, not quite able to put into words the confused tangle of emotions his return had stirred in her. Preston seemed to understand without her finishing the thought. He reached out slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she chose, and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear that had escaped from her knot. "When this is over," he promised softly, "you'll get those answers, all of them." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken feelings and the weight of their shared past. Then, with visible effort, Preston stepped back, returning to the practical concerns at hand. "The sun's almost at the horizon," he said, his voice resuming its businesslike tone. "We should take our positions." Lila nodded, gathering her resolve along with her shotgun. "Be careful out there, Preston. You too, Lila." He paused at the door, looking back at her with an expression that conveyed everything words could not. "Whatever happens tonight, I'm glad I came back." Then he was gone, moving silently toward his chosen position at the corner of the porch. Lila took a deep breath, checked her shotgun one final time, and headed for the woodpile that would serve as her initial defensive position. The sunset painted the western sky in dramatic shades of orange and purple as darkness crept across the land. Crickets began their evening chorus, interrupted occasionally by the distant howl of a coyote. Under different circumstances, Lila might have paused to appreciate the beauty of the Wyoming evening. Instead, every sense was alert for the approach of danger. The attack, when it came, arrived with surprising speed. One moment the property was quiet. The next, the thunder of hoofbeats shattered the evening stillness as riders approached from multiple directions at once. Lila counted 6 men converging on the homestead, their faces obscured by bandanas pulled up over their noses. They rode hard, clearly expecting to overwhelm any resistance through sheer force and speed. The first sign that things wouldn't go as they planned came when the lead rider's horse stumbled in one of the shallow trenches Lila and Preston had dug, sending the man tumbling from his saddle with a shout of surprise. Almost simultaneously, another rider crashed into the loosened section of fence, which collapsed under the impact. The remaining 4 riders pulled up short, momentarily confused by the unexpected obstacles. That hesitation gave Preston the opening he needed. His first shot rang out from the corner of the porch, striking one of the men in the shoulder and knocking him from his horse. Chaos erupted as the attackers realized they'd ridden into a prepared defense. They scattered, seeking cover while returning fire. Bullets thudded into the woodpile where Lila crouched, sending splinters flying. She waited for her moment, remembering Preston's advice to make each shot count. When one of the men made a dash toward the barn, exposing himself momentarily, Lila squeezed the trigger of her shotgun. The blast caught him in the leg, not a killing shot, but enough to take him out of the fight as he fell, clutching his wound and cursing loudly. From his position, Preston maintained a steady, disciplined rate of fire, carefully choosing his targets rather than shooting wildly. His accuracy forced the remaining attackers to keep their heads down, preventing them from coordinating their assault. For several minutes, the gunfight continued, the air filled with gunsmoke and the sharp crack of firearms. Lila managed to wound another attacker with her second shotgun blast, while Preston's marksmanship accounted for a third. Just as it seemed they might actually repel the assault, a new threat emerged. 2 more riders appeared from the direction of town reinforcements for the attackers. And from her position, Lila could see that one of them was Thaddeus Holloway himself, his distinctive white suit visible even in the fading light. "Preston," she called in warning. "Holloway's here with another man." Preston's response was drowned out by a renewed volley of gunfire as the remaining attackers, emboldened by the arrival of reinforcements, pressed their attack with greater aggression. A bullet splintered the wood inches from Lila's face, forcing her to duck lower behind her diminishing cover. When she raised her head again, she saw that the situation had deteriorated rapidly. The attackers had set fire to the far corner of the barn, the flames already beginning to lick upward into the dry wood. If the fire spread to the cabin, their carefully prepared defenses would become a death trap. Making a split-second decision, Lila abandoned her position behind the woodpile, darting toward the well to gather water for fighting the fire. She was halfway there when a shot kicked up dust at her feet, causing her to stumble. "That's far enough, Miss Kincaid," came a cultured voice that could only belong to Thaddeus Holloway. The railroad baron sat atop his expensive black stallion, a silver-plated revolver aimed in her direction. "The next one won't miss." Lila froze, acutely aware of her vulnerable position in the open yard. From the corner of her eye, she could see Preston shifting his aim toward Holloway, but before he could fire, one of the remaining attackers got off a shot that forced him back into cover. "I must say this is a more spirited resistance than I anticipated," Holloway continued, his tone conversational despite the violence surrounding them. "But ultimately futile. Your property will be mine by morning, Miss Kincaid, one way or another. Why are you doing this yourself?" Lila demanded, playing for time as she tried to spot a route to safety. "Isn't killing innocent people beneath a man of your standing, Mr. Holloway?" A cold smile spread across Holloway's face. "Nothing is beneath me when it comes to progress, my dear. The railroad is the future of this territory, and no stubborn homesteader or renegade deputy is going to stand in its way." His gaze shifted, scanning the property. "Speaking of which, I know Vale is here. My men saw him arrive yesterday." Preston's voice rang out from his position. "I'm right here, Holloway. Let her go and face me directly." "How gallant," Holloway sneered. "But I think not." In fact, he raised his voice to address his remaining men. $500 to the man who brings me Vale's head." The announcement spurred the attackers to renewed aggression. 2 of them began working their way around the side of the cabin, attempting to flank Preston's position. Meanwhile, The fire at the barn was spreading rapidly, its glow illuminating the darkening yard with hellish light. Trapped in the open with Holloway's gun trained on her, Lila felt a surge of desperate anger. This man had terrorized her community, framed Preston, likely ordered her father's best breeding horses poisoned last winter, and now threatened everything she held dear. In that moment of clarity, she made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of retreating, Lila lunged forward, directly toward Holloway. The unexpected move startled the railroad baron, causing his shot to go wide as Lila collided with his horse. The animal reared in alarm, unseating Holloway, who fell heavily to the ground. His silver-plated revolver skittered across the dirt. Lila scrambled for the weapon, her fingers closing around its ornate grip just as Holloway recovered enough to grab her ankle. She kicked free and rolled away, coming up with the revolver pointed at its owner. "Call them off," she demanded, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Tell your men to cease fire and leave my property immediately." Holloway's face contorted with rage. "You stupid girl. Do you think one gun changes anything? My men will kill you both, and no one will question how a brave businessman defended himself against outlaws." "Perhaps," came a new voice from the edge of the property, "but they might question why that businessman was personally leading an armed attack on a woman's home." All heads turned to see a group of riders emerging from the shadows, led by a stern-faced man wearing a U.S. Marshal's badge. Behind him rode at least a dozen armed men, including, to Lila's astonishment, several townspeople, Elias the blacksmith among them, his old Sharps rifle resting across his saddle. "Marshal Donovan," Preston called out, relief evident in his voice. "Your timing is impeccable." "Seemed like you could use some assistance, Vale," the marshal replied dryly. "Miss Kincaid, I presume?" Lila nodded, keeping Holloway's revolver trained on its owner. "This is absurd," Holloway blustered, climbing to his feet but freezing when Lila cocked the hammer of his own weapon. "Marshal, I was merely defending my investments against a notorious outlaw. That man is Preston Vale, wanted in 3 territories." "Yes, I'm well aware of who he is," Donovan replied, dismounting and approaching with measured steps. "Just as I'm aware of the evidence he's gathered against you over the past 2 years. Evidence that strongly suggests you framed him for murder, among other crimes." Holloway's face paled visibly in the firelight. "Whatever he's told you, it's lies, the ravings of a desperate criminal." "Perhaps," Donovan acknowledged, "but the testimony of your former accountant, who turned himself into my office this morning with a complete set of your financial records, is considerably more compelling." This news seemed to genuinely shock Holloway. "Richards betrayed me. That's impossible." "Not betrayal conscience," the marshal corrected him. "Apparently, ordering the deaths of homesteaders was a step too far even for a man who'd helped you bribe officials across the territory." As Marshal Donovan continued speaking, Layla became aware of Preston moving to her side, his presence solid and reassuring as the tension of the standoff began to dissipate. The marshal's men were already securing the surviving attackers, while several townspeople had formed a bucket brigade to combat the barn fire. "It's over," Preston said quietly, gently taking Holloway's silver revolver from her trembling hand. "You're safe now." The adrenaline that had sustained Lila throughout the fight began to ebb, leaving her light-headed and shaky. She leaned against Preston's side, allowing herself to draw strength from his steadiness. "Your marshal friend was supposed to arrive tomorrow morning," she reminded him with a weak attempt at humor. Preston's arm slipped around her waist, supporting her more fully. "I may have told you that to prevent you from taking unnecessary risks." Donovan promised to gather reinforcements and follow as quickly as possible. "You lied to protect me," Lila asked, torn between irritation and gratitude. "I omitted certain details," Preston corrected with the ghost of a smile. "For tactical reasons." Before Lila could respond, Marshal Donovan approached them, having handed Holloway off to his deputies. "Vale," he nodded in greeting, then tipped his hat respectfully to Lila. "Miss Kincaid, I apologize for the damage to your property. We came as quickly as we could once we received Mr. Cooper's message." "Elias sent for you," Lila asked, glancing toward where the blacksmith was helping direct the firefighting efforts. "Rode like the devil himself was chasing him," Donovan confirmed. "Caught up with us about 5 miles out and reported that Holloway's men were preparing to ride on your homestead. Lucky thing we were already on our way." Preston extended his hand to the marshal. "Thank you, Donovan, for everything." The marshal clasped his hand firmly. "You did most of the hard work these past 2 years, Vale. Gathering evidence, tracking Holloway's operations, risking your neck when it would have been easier to just keep running." He paused, then added with a slight smile, "Which reminds me I have something for you." Donovan reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document, which he handed to Preston. "Official pardon from the territorial governor, based on the evidence we've gathered proving your innocence in the Blackwater murder. As of this moment, Preston Vale, you are no longer a wanted man." Preston stared at the document in disbelief, his fingers tracing the official seal as though to verify its reality. "I never expected. I thought clearing my name would involve a trial testimony." "There may still be some legal proceedings," Donovan cautioned, "but with Richard's testimony and documentation, plus what we found in Holloway's office after arresting him today, the governor was satisfied of your innocence. He signed the pardon this morning before I rode out." The full import of the marshal's words gradually registered with Lila. "You arrested Holloway this morning, in town," Donovan nodded, "for wire fraud and bribery of federal officials, charges that didn't require your involvement, Miss Kincaid. When we searched his office, we found detailed plans for tonight's attack on your property. That's why we were already en route when Mr. Cooper found us." "But if you had Holloway in custody, how did he end up here?" Preston asked, his brow furrowed in confusion. A grimace crossed the marshal's weathered face. "He escaped during transport, my fault for underestimating his resources. Apparently, he had men waiting along the road who ambushed my deputies. 2 of my men were wounded before Holloway rode free. And he came straight here to personally oversee my removal," Lila concluded, a chill running through her despite the heat from the nearby fire. "Which proved to be his final mistake," Donovan said grimly. "Adding attempted murder and escape from federal custody to his existing charges ensures Thaddeus Holloway won't see freedom again in his lifetime." As they spoke, the firefighting efforts were succeeding in containing the blaze. Though one corner of the barn was severely damaged, the structure as a whole had been saved, along with the cabin and other outbuildings. The physical wounds of the attack would heal with time and labor. "What happens now?" Lila asked, looking between Preston and the marshal. "Now," Donovan replied, "we clean up this mess and get the wounded to a doctor. Tomorrow, I'll need statements from both of you about tonight's events to add to the case against Holloway and his men." He glanced at Preston. "And you, Vale, are free to decide what you want to do with your life now that you're no longer running." With that, the marshal tipped his hat again and moved off to supervise his deputies, leaving Lila and Preston standing alone amid the aftermath of the battle. Around them, townspeople and lawmen worked to secure prisoners, tend to the wounded, and extinguish the last of the fire, but in that moment, they might as well have been the only 2 people in the world. "It doesn't feel real," Preston said quietly, still holding the pardon in his hand. 3 years of running, hiding, gathering evidence, and now it's over. Lila studied his face in the flickering light of the dying fire. "What will you do now? With your freedom?" Preston turned to her, his green eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "That depends entirely on you, Lila. On me," she repeated, her heart beginning to race for reasons entirely unrelated to danger. 3 years ago, under the cottonwood tree, I made you a promise," Preston reminded her softly. "I said I'd come back for you when it was safe, when I could offer you more than the life of an outlaw's woman." Lila remembered that night with perfect clarity, the moonlight filtering through the leaves, the sound of the creek nearby, the mixture of desperation and determination in Preston's voice as he'd asked her to wait for him. "You kept that promise," she acknowledged. "You came back. But I'm not presumptuous enough to assume that your feelings remain unchanged," Preston continued, his voice rough with emotion. 3 years is a long time, Lila. I wouldn't blame you if you'd moved on, found someone else, or simply decided you wanted a different future than the one we talked about that night. Lila thought about the men who had expressed interest in courting her over the past 3 years, the banker's son, the young doctor who'd recently set up practice in town, even the widowed rancher from the next county. She had turned them all away, telling herself it was because of her responsibilities to her father and the homestead. But in her heart, she had always known the truth. None of them was Preston Vale. I waited, she said simply. Not always patiently, not always without anger or doubt, but I waited. Hope dawned in Preston's eyes. And now, instead of answering with words, Lila closed the distance between them, rising on her tiptoes to press her lips to his. It was a bold move for a woman who had been raised with strict notions of propriety, but after facing down armed killers and standing her ground against Holloway himself, kissing the man she loved seemed like the simplest, most natural thing in the world. Preston's response was immediate and fervent. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer as he returned her kiss with a passion that spoke of 3 years of longing. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, the expression on Preston's face was one of wonder and joy. I take it that means you still have feelings for me, he said, a smile spreading across his features. It means, Lila replied, her own smile matching his, that I expect you to keep the rest of your promises, Preston Vale. Every single one, he vowed, pressing his forehead to hers in a gesture of intimate connection. Starting today. As the night deepened around them, the chaos of the attack gradually gave way to order. The wounded were tended to, the prisoners secured, the fire fully extinguished. Townspeople who had ridden to their aid offered assistance in repairing the damage, their attitudes toward Preston visibly shifting as word of his pardon, and the truth about Holloway spread through their ranks. Elias Cooper approached them as they sat on the porch steps, drinking coffee that someone had thought to brew amidst all the activity. Never thought I'd see the day when half the town rode out to help Preston Vale fight off the railroad, the blacksmith remarked with a chuckle. Times surely do change. Thanks to you, Elias, Lila said warmly. If you hadn't brought reinforcements, the older man waved off her gratitude. Just doing what Matthew would have done. He always said this community had to stand together against men like Holloway. He looked between Lila and Preston, a knowing glint in his eye. Speaking of standing together, am I to assume that certain arrangements might be forthcoming between you two? Preston glanced at Lila, a question in his eyes. At her slight nod, he turned back to Elias with a smile. If Miss Kincaid will have me, yes, though I'll need to establish myself again before I can properly provide for a wife. Well now, Elias stroked his beard thoughtfully, it just so happens that Redemption Creek finds itself in need of a new sheriff. Our current one was arrested this afternoon, apparently for taking bribes from a certain railroad baron. Preston's eyebrows rose in surprise. Sheriff Watts was arrested, along with Deputy Collins and Judge Peterson, Elias confirmed. Marshal Donovan's been busy cleaning house. Word is the town council will be meeting tomorrow to discuss temporary appointments until proper elections can be held. The implication was clear. Preston, with his law enforcement experience and now cleared name, would be a natural candidate for the position. The thought of Preston as sheriff of Redemption Creek, the very role he'd been working toward before being framed, struck Lila as both fitting and somewhat ironic. I'd need to think about that, Preston said cautiously. There are other considerations now. He glanced meaningfully at Lila. You should do it, she told him without hesitation. It's what you were meant for, Preston, and the town needs someone they can trust after all Holloway's corruption. But what about your homestead, your father's legacy? Lila smiled, taking his hand in hers. A legacy isn't just about land, Preston. It's about values, about standing up for what's right. Father would be proud to see you as sheriff, working to make this community what he always believed it could be. Preston squeezed her hand gently. And us. Would you be content as a sheriff's wife? More than content, Lila assured him. Though I have no intention of giving up running this ranch, we'll manage both together. Elias watched their exchange with undisguised approval. Well, I'll leave you two to sort out the details. Just know that you've got friends in town ready to support whatever you decide. He tipped his hat and ambled off to where his gray mare was tethered, leaving them alone once more. As the night wore on, the crowd at the homestead gradually thinned. Marshal Donovan departed with his prisoners, including Holloway, bound for the federal courthouse in Cheyenne. Most of the townspeople returned to their homes, though a few remained to keep watch through the night in case any of Holloway's men who'd escaped decided to return. In the quiet hours before dawn, Lila and Preston sat together on the porch swing that her father had built, watching as the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. The events of the past 2 days had transformed both their lives in ways neither could have predicted, opening doors that had seemed permanently closed. "It's strange," Lila mused, her head resting on Preston's shoulder. "Yesterday morning, I woke up believing I was alone in this fight. That I might lose everything my parents worked for. Now, Preston prompted when she trailed off. Lila tilted her face up to his. "Now I feel like I've gained more than I ever imagined possible, not just safety from Holloway, but a future I'd almost stopped hoping for." Preston brushed a gentle kiss across her forehead. "I promised you once that I'd come back when I could offer you a proper life, a future without shadows. It took longer than I expected, but I intend to make good on that promise in every way." "Does that mean you're going to accept the sheriff's position if it's offered?" "I think I am," Preston acknowledged. "It feels right somehow, coming full circle." Lila nodded against his shoulder. "From fugitive to sheriff, it's quite a story." "Our story is just beginning," Preston reminded her, his arm tightening around her waist. "And I plan for it to be a long and happy one." As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, they remained on the porch, planning their future together in quiet voices. There would be challenges ahead, rebuilding the damaged barn, re-establishing Preston's place in the community, combining their lives in a way that honored both their dreams. But after all they had overcome already, these seemed like welcome challenges rather than insurmountable obstacles. 3 weeks later, on a perfect autumn afternoon, Lila Kincaid and Preston Vale were married under the cottonwood tree by the creek, the very spot where they had exchanged promises 3 years earlier. The entire town turned out for the celebration, their presence a testament to how quickly perceptions can change when truth replaces lies. Preston wore his new sheriff's badge on his best black coat, having been unanimously appointed by the town council following Holloway's arrest. Lila wore her mother's wedding dress, altered by the skilled hands of Louise Cooper to fit her slender frame, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a formal veil. Marshal Donovan attended as Preston's best man, their partnership during the investigation having forged a lasting friendship. Elias Cooper gave the bride away in Matthew Kincaid's absence, though Lila felt her father's presence in the familiar surroundings of the homestead where he had raised her. As they spoke their vows beneath the rustling leaves of the cottonwood, the events that had brought them to this moment seemed both distant and immediate, the painful separation, the years of struggle, the violent confrontation that had nearly cost them everything. But those hardships had tested and proven the strength of their connection, transforming a youthful romance into something deeper and more enduring. "I promise to stand beside you through whatever challenges life brings," Preston vowed, his voice carrying clearly to the assembled guests. "To build a life of honesty, courage, and love with you, here in the community we both cherish." "And I promise to face those challenges at your side," Lila responded, her eyes never leaving his. "To create a home and a future worthy of all we've overcome to reach this day." When they sealed their vows with a kiss, the cheer that rose from the gathered townspeople seemed to echo across the Wyoming landscape, carrying with it the promise of new beginnings born from the ashes of conflict. The celebration continued well into the evening, with tables set up in the yard of the homestead, laden with food contributed by every family in Redemption Creek. Lanterns hung from tree branches illuminated the dancing and festivities as twilight deepened into night. Standing apart for a moment as they watched their friends and neighbors enjoying the celebration, Preston drew Lila close to his side. "Happy?" he asked softly. "Completely," she assured him, her arms slipping around his waist. "Though I still can't quite believe how much has changed in such a short time." A month ago, I was fighting to hold onto this land alone. Now you're stuck with me, Preston finished with a smile, for better or worse, as the preacher said. Definitely for better, Lila replied, returning his smile, though I expect being married to the sheriff will bring its own challenges. As will being married to the most stubborn rancher in Wyoming, Preston countered good-naturedly. Their gentle teasing was interrupted by Elias Cooper calling for attention, raising a glass for a toast to the newlyweds. As the gathering quieted, the blacksmith's voice carried across the yard. To Preston and Lila Vale, he proclaimed. May your union bring you the joy you deserve after all you've endured, and may your story remind us all that sometimes what appears to be an ending is merely the beginning of something even better. Glasses were raised all around as voices echoed the sentiment. Looking out over the faces of friends and neighbors who had once shunned Preston as an outlaw, but now embraced him as their sheriff, Lila felt a sense of completion that went beyond personal happiness. This was healing not just for her and Preston, but for the entire community that had been fractured by Holloway's influence. Later that night, after the guests had departed, and they were alone in the cabin that would serve as their home until Preston completed the addition he'd already begun planning, Lila stood by the window, gazing out at the moonlit landscape of her father's homestead, now their homestead. Preston came up behind her, his arms encircling her waist as he followed her gaze across the silver-touched land. "What are you thinking about, Mrs. Vale?" The new name sent a pleasant shiver through Lila. "I was thinking about the night you rode back into my life. How afraid I was when I saw you approaching, knowing what it might mean." "And now?" Preston asked, his breath warm against her ear. Lila turned in his arms, raising her hands to frame his face. "Now I understand that some risks are worth taking. That sometimes the most wanted man in town turns out to be exactly what you need." Preston's laughter was low and warm as he drew her closer. "I believe that works both ways, my love." As their lips met in a kiss that promised a lifetime of companionship, challenges overcome together, and love that had weathered separation and danger to emerge stronger. The moon cast its gentle light through the window, illuminating the beginning of their shared journey, a journey that had started years before under the cottonwood tree, and would continue long into the future. They would build together in the heart of the Wyoming territory. In the years that followed, the tale of Preston Vale, the outlaw who became sheriff, and Lila Kincaid, the woman who stood her ground against the most powerful man in the territory, became something of a legend in Redemption Creek. Parents told their children how Preston had ridden past every man in town to knock on Lila's door when she needed him most, and how together they had turned the tide against corruption and greed. What the stories sometimes missed was the quieter courage of everyday life, the challenges of combining Lila's management of the ranch with Preston's duties as sheriff, the difficult seasons when drought or harsh winters threatened their livelihood, the occasional resurgence of doubts about whether Preston's reputation would ever fully recover from his years as a fugitive. But through it all, they faced each challenge together, their partnership growing stronger with each obstacle overcome. And when, 2 years after their wedding, Lila gave birth to twins, a boy with his father's green eyes and a girl with her mother's determined spirit, their joy seemed to complete the circle of renewal that had begun on the day Preston Vale rode back to Redemption Creek to knock on the door of the woman who had never stopped waiting for him. In time, the railroad did come to Redemption Creek, but on the community's terms rather than through coercion. Preston, as sheriff, and Lila, who had become a respected voice on the town council, helped negotiate agreements that protected local interests while embracing the progress that connection to the wider world brought. And on summer evenings, when the day's work was done and the children were asleep, they would often sit together on the porch of their expanded home, watching the sun set over the land they both loved. In those quiet moments, the struggles of the past seemed distant, overshadowed by the life they had built from the ashes of conflict, a life anchored in the promises made and kept between a man who had once been the most wanted outlaw in the territory and the woman who had given him a reason to come home.